I'm really excited tonight to be having Hermione Lee talking about my favourite, there you are, I've declared a preference there, dramatist Tom Stoppard and her extraordinary new book, which in total length is almost 1,000 words, but is some 850 pages of text. A really extraordinary, phenomenal book, which will do, I imagine, confidently, phenomenally well critically, and in terms of sales, it certainly deserves to do so. Please have your questions ready. If you're new to the series, type them in. If you're on a platform where you can't type in, then can you make a note of this just very simple email address, which is Matthew.Thompson with a P in Thompson at buckingham.ac.uk. Thanks to Buckingham University for organising this series of lectures. We traditionally have some 3,000-4,000 plus listening in. Please have your questions. I try and make it as conversational as possible. With that in mind, I'm going to ask Hermione, where are you? What city and what room in your house are you?
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I wish we were on a platform with a real audience, but I'm imagining the audience out there, and very pleased to be here. I'm in Oxford, where I live, and I'm in a sort of small conservatory, which is the room where I do all my business work, like writing lectures and paying bills. The room where I actually do my writing of books is down the other end of the garden, and it's a work shed. But I thought it would be a bad idea to do the interview in here because the Wi-Fi reception is very poor in my work shed, which makes it a great place to think and write.
Well, I'm heartily glad about that, because we've had connections. That's another thing that can go wrong with these online talks, but there are advantages to them, not least the number who can be listening and enjoying you talking tonight. So could you just begin by describing, Hermione, your day, and in particular how it changed when in 2017 you gave up your day job? Do you write at a set time every day?
Yes, I learned to be quite disciplined while I was teaching at Oxford, and before that at York and Liverpool, and then when I was running, when I was president of Wilson College, which is a big graduate college in Oxford, from 2008 to 2017. So I would do my college work during the day, and then fit the writing mainly into the weekends and sometimes into evenings, and into vacations. And then I had this extraordinary moment in September 2017 when I still hadn't finished this book, but suddenly had all day in which to write it. So that was a moment of great pleasure, actually, although I miss lots of things about being in the college. Where I have a life writing centre, which I founded, and that's been very, very important to me for the last few years.
Do talk about that centre.
Yes, I founded a centre called the Oxford Centre for Life Writing at Wilson College soon after I arrived there, with some wonderful funding from patrons and helpers, and there's a team of us. I've now sort of stepped back, but I'm still involved, and we do everything to do with life writing, workshops for people writing biographies, programs about different kinds of life writing, big name lectures. So it's great fun, and it's very helpful to me and to other people like me who are actually in the middle of writing biographies or memoirs.
Did you find the burden of administration was occupying a different part of your brain to writing? Did they sit comfortably alongside each other?
You will know about this. And it is, I think, a different part of one's brain. It's a sort of decision making, very busy and sort of out front kind of part of one's life, where you are all the time talking to people and and asking people things and in conversation with people. And of course, one of the strange things about writing, although biography to start with is a very social process, because in the early days of writing a biography, you are talking to lots of people and witnesses and friends and so on. And then you go into your shed, as it were, and you are there on your own, talking to yourself, thinking for yourself day after day. I've never been very good at collaborative work, though I did have a very enjoyable time recently with my colleague at the Life Writing Centre, Kate Kennedy, putting together a book called Lives of Houses, which was a nice collection about the biography of houses. So that was collaborative and that was great fun. But when I'm writing my own book, I'm very much in solitude, mental solitude, and all writers know about this. So yes, it's two kinds of selves, I think.
And how much writing can you do a day? What's your optimum number before it becomes counterproductive?
I'm not like Anthony Trollope, who set himself a word count every single day of his life, and if he hadn't fulfilled the word count when he finished a book, he would immediately start the next book because that was part of the word count. So I'm not like that. But there are days when it goes swimmingly and you might write maybe 3 or 4 pages, I suppose. And there are days when you scribble out a paragraph that you thought was okay. And there are many days when you go to bed at night thinking, I wish someone else would come into my work shed overnight and write the next bit for me, so that when I get up in the morning, I go into the shed, it'll be there, it'll sort of magically be there. So, you know, we all have blocks.
And you write, do you, rather than type or dictate or anything?
There's a strange thing about the process of it coming out of your brain into your hand onto a piece of paper. So I actually confess that I do write the first draft and then I correct on screen. So the very first draft is written, yeah. Pencil,
fountain pen?
Oh, ballpoint.
Okay. Now, just to show, and as an encouragement to others to ask questions, just to show how live and interactive this is, Christine Dodds, nay Bruce, says not a question, but just to say that Hermione and I were pupils in the same class at the lycée in South Kensington until I moved to Windsor on my 9th birthday, and I followed her career with great interest. So there you are, Christine.
I left when I was 8. I had learnt to speak French, but not to read it very well. I had learnt about Vercingétorix, and I had learnt to tie my shoelaces, and that's all I can remember learning at the lycée.
Well, those are the important things in life. It set you up. When did you know that you wanted to write?
Oh, I think round about then, probably. I mean, I was torn between wanting to be an actor and wanting to be a writer. So I wrote a lot of very bad teenage novels, which I hasten to say have been done away with, I should say. Then I went to Oxford as a student, and then I suppose I started writing in the early 70s. My first book was a book about the novels of Virginia Woolf, which came out in 1977. And then later on, I became much more interested in writing biography rather than criticism. But I came to biography out of literary criticism.
So what was happening there, and what is it about biography that makes you want to get inside the mind and the life of the subject?
Yes, I think I was rather resistant to the movements in the 70s in critical theory. I felt rather unhappy and uncomfortable with structuralism and deconstructionism, and I think the reason for that was that I didn't enjoy the idea of the death of the author, because at the same time I was reading some of those astonishing books that came out in the 70s and in the early 80s, books like, you know, I sort of cut my teeth on Richard Ellman's Joyce, and Leon Edell's Henry James, and George Painter's Proust, and then Quentin Bell's Virginia Woolf, so that, and Michael Holroyd's Lytton Strachey. These were very, very important books to me, and I found them very exciting. I found that I never wanted to sort of simplistically say, this is the life and this is the work, and they match onto each other, because I don't think you can do that. But I was very excited by that negotiation between the life and the work.
So are you, so that excitement there kindled what has blossomed so successfully. Is the biographer a detective, a psychoanalyst? How deep can you go? How do you see yourself?
Well, there was a phase, wasn't there, when biographers turned themselves into psychoanalysts, and you would get, and in fact, looking back on some of those great biographies of that time, like the Leon Edell, Henry James, I'm sort of amazed going back to them how psychoanalytical they were, and how it was a sort of fashion to pin the writer's career onto the traumas of childhood and so on. And that, obviously, to an extent, that can be true and that can work. But I think of myself less as a, you know, if I'm a psychoanalyst, I'm an untrained one. So that's a very dangerous place to be. And of course, you've got to be partly a detective. You've got to be a portraitist. So as Boswell and Johnson would say, it's got to be warts and all. And you've also got to be a ruthless carrier out of an autopsy. I think that, you know, there are many different ways in which the biographer approaches their subject. I'm very moved by a now very unfashionable writer, Thomas Carlyle, who wrote a lot about biography in the 19th century and said that the deep motive for writing the life of another person should be love. Now, I don't think that's the case for me. I'm not in love with my subjects ever, but I think there has to be some form of tender enthusiasm or a certain amount of passionate involvement with the subject. I couldn't do it if I wasn't interested in the work, and if I wasn't keen on the work and didn't feel inspired by the work.
I like tender enthusiasm. How close can you get to the subject? Can you get closer to understanding them than they can themselves?
I don't know the answer to that. And Richard Holmes the biographer Richard Holmes has a wonderful, well-known image of the broken bridge at Avignon, which is in his great book Footsteps: The Adventures of a Romantic Biographer. So you can get to the edge, get to the end of the broken bridge, but you can't cross over, because that's the past, and that is not crossable into, but you can go as far as you possibly can, and you won't quite catch the person, but you will hope to get as close as possible. There is a strange thing that happens when you're in the middle of writing a biography, where you have to take possession. You have to feel as if you know this person very well. You have to feel that your version of them is somehow going to have an impact's wrong, that your version of them is going to be true as it can be. But all the time you must clinically know that they are separate from you. There are going to be gaps. There are going to be things you never find out. I like that. I like the gaps in biography.
I really like that, your statement there about gaps. Just one quick personal recollection. John Major once said to me, when I asked him a question, he said, well, you know me better than anybody. So, and then he said, actually, you know me better than I know myself. And in a way, I thought that was true. Questions are really flooding in now. Who do you think, you might not want to answer this, of your various subjects did you get closest to in terms of understanding their essence?
I suppose I feel that I got very close in a strange way to Penelope Fitzgerald, whose biography I wrote in 2013, published in 2013. I had known her a bit, and I knew her. I got to know her family. I became aware that she was an extremely elusive, even mischievous person. She's a profoundly great writer. And there was a certain amount of masquerading going on, I think, in her life, where she pretended to be a sort of daffy old lady, or she pretended to be mild and unassuming. Actually, she was ferociously brilliant and well aware of her own brilliance, and quite unforgiving, I think, actually, of other people, and also very secretive. So, for instance, she wrote a wonderful novel set in Moscow just before the revolution called The Beginning of Spring. And if the audience hasn't read this book, they should immediately.
I was going to ask you, is that the Fitzgerald, The Beginning of Spring,
yes,
the book that you would most direct people to?
It was her favourite book, actually, and it's certainly one of mine. And it's a brilliant recreation of Moscow in the early 20th century. And so people would repeatedly say to her, gosh, you must have spent a lot of time there. And sometimes she would say, yes, I spent months and months there. And sometimes she would say, depending on how she was feeling in a situation like this, no, I've never been there in my life. And the truth was, she'd been on a package tour for a week to Moscow. I find this very funny.
Yeah. So 2014, you start writing Stoppard. So we'll now talk about the writing of this book that took 6 years. Why did you choose Tom Stoppard?
He approached me to write his biography. I think he was moving house. He was tidying up lots of papers. I think people had been coming at him and asking him if they could write about him, and there had already been one biography which he hadn't had very much to do with. So I think he was sort of looking to get that sorted out so that he would stop being bothered by it. And it was a big surprise to me in that I had only ever written before about novelists. I was not a sort of, fully paid up theatre person. I'm not a theatre critic. I mean, I've got a great interest in.
But you like drama. You like drama. That was essential. Obviously.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I've always loved the work, and I thought this was an astonishing opportunity. So I said yes immediately, and then got down to work and realised it was a big task.
So in general terms, what do you most want from your subject?
What do you mean?
What are you looking for that's going to really help you write a story, a biography that's going to illuminate and take us on? And do you then hope, if they're a living subject, that they'll then die before publication?
Well, I don't think biographers should be sort of going around saying, now, what do I want from my subject? So a famous biographer once said to me, make sure they don't just fade away. Make sure they've got a really dramatic or gruesome death so that you can get a really good punchline at the end. I mean, in this case, that has not been the case. I've never written about a living subject before. I mean, I knew Penelope Fitzgerald a little bit and I interviewed her, but I didn't know at the time that I was going to be her biographer. So this is a first for me. Obviously, if you are writing about a living subject, you very much hope that they will be helpful. Samuel Beckett famously said to his first biographer, "I will neither help nor hinder," which is characteristically quizzical. Tom Stoppard has not hindered and he has helped, and he has been exceptionally generous and patient. We've had lots of conversations in which he has really given me carte blanche to ask him anything, actually, which I think must be rare.
That helpfulness and generosity and kindness is, as you discussed, double-edged. How do you negotiate that? How do you avoid being seduced?
Well, yes, a grand old lady who was a friend of his did say to me at one point, "Beware of the charm," which I thought was a good lesson. you know that the person is going to tell you what they want to tell you, because, and it must be difficult for them too, because they are thinking, oh, what's she going to do with this? But you know, there are certain things, I'm sure, that they're not telling you. I think what you have to do is talk to as many friends and companions and colleagues and family members as you possibly can, so that you don't only get the version that the person is giving you, but that you also do get other people's versions. I may say that in this case, they were remarkably consistent. The things that he said about his own life and the things that other people said about him, although of course they praised him much more than he would ever praise himself. But I thought that there was a remarkable consistency between his own version of his life and other people's version of it.
What fundamentally, Hermione, were you trying to do in the biography? Tell the story of his life, tell the story of the evolution of the writing. What question above all were you trying to answer, or questions?
Yes, it may sound very peculiar, but I don't actually set out to write a book with a principal question in mind. I set out to find my way into what this person is like and how their life bears on their writing, and what kind of public reputation they have as well, which I think is important, the private self and the public self both. But I've never set out to say, right, I want to see if Tom Stoppard has a double life, or I want to see if Jewishness is the key factor in Tom Stoppard's life. This is not the way I work. I mean, these questions will come up and be very important. He said to me when we were starting our conversation, he said, "You'll find I've had a very exciting life up to the age of 8. Which I thought was a wonderful challenge. And indeed, the life up to the age of 8 when he arrives in England is a very, very extraordinary life. So it was partly clearly about trying to find my way into that life, which involved going to the Czech Republic and involved going to India, and then tracing him back to Bristol, and so on. So yes, there was a certain amount of following that early childhood path. And then I think above all, it was to try and understand where this astonishing energy and brilliance and verve and gusto come out of, and how they make themselves felt in so many different kinds of work. It's very extraordinary writing about someone who's a playwright and a script writer for films, and a radio play writer, and someone who is absolutely hands-on with many, many productions of his plays. And so he will go back to any revival and make sure and look after his play, as he puts it. And so that astonishing range of energetic activity and concentration is phenomenal to me. So when you're writing a book about someone like that, you want, you know, that thing you sometimes want writing to be more like music. If only you could do sort of 10 staves at once on the page, so that it doesn't have to be linear. You know, I always try and avoid the word meanwhile when I'm writing biography, because I think it's so depressing. Meanwhile, he was still working on, you know, but there's a lot of meanwhile going on in my head while I was writing it.
There have been some famously catastrophic relationships between biographers and living artists.
No, really?
But you avoided that. And are you as you've got to know him better during the course of it? What most surprised you about him in the 6 years?
He has been all the way through a very steadily patient and, as I said, generous in giving me time, and he's a busy man, for conversations. And these conversations have been long conversations, you know, sometimes over a day or so. He's also given me things to read, which I have been intensely grateful for. So I'll just give you a few examples. One was a little black notebook which he was keeping while he was writing his novel, which is not a very well-known book, Lord Malquist and Mr. Moon, and his play Rosencrantz at the same time. This was so this notebook goes between sort of 64 and 66 probably, and it's just full of aphorisms, notes, scribbles, thoughts, quotations from T.S. Eliot, who was a big influence at that time. And you can see from it how his mind is working on that play and what's going into Rosencrantz, and that was an extraordinary thing to be shown. He kept a journal for a while, which he kept mainly in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, and he let me see that, and that was very helpful. And the most extraordinary thing of all is that from 1948, when he was at school, till 1996, when she died, he wrote a weekly, or sometimes even twice weekly, letter to his mother, to whom he was very close. And these letters, mostly undated, so they had to be dated from internal evidence. These lifelong letters provide a kind of diary, actually. I mean, it's a son writing to his mother, so he doesn't want to worry her. So there are lots of things that he wouldn't have mentioned, but he gives her a kind of diary of what he's doing, because he clearly wanted her to stay in touch and to know what he was up to and not to feel that he'd gone far, far away. And I found this collection of letters extremely moving and extremely useful.
And cited liberally in the book.
Yeah, with his permission.
And one of the great benefits of him being alive is that you could be there in rehearsals, so Leopoldstadt, and then in the revivals of Travesties and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. What were you getting from that?
I was able to, thanks to the directors, I mean, and Tom Stoppard always very punctiliously and carefully said that will be up to the directors as to whether, you know, it's fine with me, but it's up to them as to whether it's okay for you to sit in. I was just very lucky to be able to come in sometimes just at the very final stages. But David Laveau, who directed, I think, brilliantly, the revival, the 50th anniversary revival of Rosencrantz at the Old Vic, let me sit in for quite a few rehearsals. So there was this extraordinary phenomenon to me. One is that most of the people in the room, apart from William Chubb playing Polonius, were, I think, probably not born when the first production of Rosencrantz went to the Old Vic in 1967. And so Daniel Radcliffe and Josh Maguire, who were playing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, would be asking Tom Stoppard questions about their roles and about the play, and he would answer them as freshly as if this was the first production of this play. And he was also sometimes say, oh, let's put a bit more of Gertrude in there, in the Hamlet bits. Let's just have another, shall we have another couple of lines of her? So this is a book which for 50 years has been a sort of sacrosanct O-level, A-level, university theatre production text. And this is a person who feels that plays are not set in stone, that a play, as he often says, is an event, not a text. And so he's willing to sit there in the rehearsal room and say, yes, all right, we could put something else in there. I mean, not hugely, but enough to make you think, my goodness, this really is for him an open-ended art form.
William Chubb, by the way, will be flattered, Hermione, at the suggestion he wasn't alive, because
no, he was the one who was.
But he was also he played Romeo in a production I directed in Oxford in 1976 with the Black Juliet, Muriel O'Dunton, and very sparkling and wonderful he was in that. Let's come back to the early Stoppard, born in 1937, July 3rd, I think, and that influence, that extraordinary early life in framing and shaping him. Just a few thoughts about that.
His father was Eugen Streusler, was the Jewish doctor in for the hospital for Barcia, which was the big Czech shoemaking firm, which pretty much was the town of Zlín in Moravia. And he had a very, you know, they were a very happy family there, an older brother. He was a baby there in Zlín. And then the Nazis came in 1939, and like many other families, they fled. They were refugees and emigres, and they fled to Singapore. And then Tom was 18 months old at that time, and then the Japanese invaded Singapore, and they fled again. His father was killed on a ship going out of the harbour at Singapore. His mother, with her two little boys, Tom by then age 4, thought she was on a ship to Australia. There was huge confusion. They were put on another ship and ended up in India. She found her way to the Bata community. Bata is a big international, worldwide shoemaking firm, and she found her way to the Bata communities where the people got looked after. She didn't find out for quite a time that her husband had been killed. Tom and his brother Peter went to school in India. They ended up in Darjeeling. They went to a school called Mount Hermon, where they talked English. It was an English teaching school. They were boarders. His mother worked in the Bata shoe shop, and then she married an English major, Ken Stoppard, and they went to England, where he arrived in February 1946, aged 8, and became Tom Stoppard. And as he says, he put on Englishness like a coat.
What shaped him from that point onwards to become this playwright? Until I saw it in the book, the long list of plays, I had no idea quite how much he had written. You list the one about page 877. I daren't open the book here because I might lose you, but an enormous range. What was it in particular that propelled him to start writing?
He wasn't particularly interested in drama at school. He started to read. It wasn't a particularly reading household. He started to read for himself. Well, his mother loved to read, but there weren't huge numbers of books in the house. He knew that he wanted to leave home. He knew he wanted to get to work. And he loved the idea of journalism. So he didn't go to university. He left school at 17, and he got a job in Bristol, working in the local newspapers in Bristol. And Bristol in the 50s, I mean, this was in 54, and he stayed there till 62, and then he moved to London. So that period in Bristol was his university, as it were, and he fell in love with the theatre at the Bristol Old Vic. Peter O'Toole was there as a dazzling young star, and that was a very important friendship for him. He wrote theatre reviews, he wrote arts columns, he wrote journalism. He was at one point he was the motoring correspondent for the local paper, and had to spend the whole time concealing from everyone the fact he couldn't drive. So there were all kinds of, comic moments in this growing up. And he did a lot of film reviews, and then he got a job on a magazine called Scene, which was a very trendy magazine in London, short-lived and trendy, in 62, and he did a lot of play reviewing there. And then he knew he wanted to, from about the age of 19, 20, he knew he wanted to be a writer, and he knew he wanted to be a dramatist above all, because at that time, the most thrilling critic in the land at that time to him was Kenneth Tynan. the most exciting thing was the idea that you could write a play and it would go on, and Kenneth Tynan would write a good review and then everybody would go and see it. And, you know, it was a much faster road to fame and success than spending 5 years writing a novel. So, and then he turned to, once he was in London, he didn't have any money. He didn't have any great successes. He turned his hand to absolutely everything. And as you say, there's an astonishing list of radio plays, one-act television plays. This was a time when radio and television were rich places for up-and-coming young writers. And then he was working on this play. He got himself an agent. He wrote 3 early plays.
Walk on Water.
Yes, and he started to work on a play which originally was going to be called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern at the Court of King Lear. The idea was that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern would go to England and King Lear would be on the throne.
Great idea.
Yeah, brilliant idea. And then that gradually turned into the play we know. And in 1966, by a chapter of accidents, it was put on by a group of Oxford actors at the Edinburgh Festival. And a critic called Rob Brydon picked it up and said, greatest new play, you know, fantastic. And then everybody jumped to attention, and that's when he became extremely famous and successful, pretty much overnight.
Very quickly. And what was it? What had he done in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern that was so innovative and unusual?
It seems so daring to take these rather sad minor characters out of Hamlet and to turn them into these central figures. There was clearly a lot of Beckett in the air, and there was that feeling which I think was very perfect for its time. I hate to use the word zeitgeist, but you know what I mean. That sense of 2 characters who don't know why they're there, they don't know where they're going, they don't know what they're supposed to do. They've been told to do something and they're thwarted at every turn. They know that time is passing. They're trying to make it pass, rather like Estragon and Vladimir. And every so often the Hamlet play bursts in on them and they don't know what the hell. So they play all these brilliant word games to sort of pass the time, like tennis matches. There was something. I remember what this felt like in the late 60s. It felt like our play. It felt like a young audience's play, and people just loved that wordplay and the sort of dazzling hubris of turning Shakespeare upside down and taking him. And it somehow hit a nerve. And also I think of it as a rather melancholy play, as well as a very brilliantly funny play. There's something melancholy about it, about the passage of time, about the brownness of autumn coming on, about them never knowing why they were there or what they were doing. And I think people, even when people were laughing their heads off all the way through, I think they found it moving, touching.
It is melancholic, isn't it? And from there, where does he go? The next significant mark that he makes?
Well, Jumpers.
Where would you place Real Inspector Hound?
Oh, I think it's a work of great genius. I adore Real Inspector Hound. The idea that these 2 competitive theatre critics get sucked into the play, which turns out to be this murder mystery. And he always said he knew there was a body on the stage, but he'd no idea who the body was. And then only towards the end of writing it did he realise, of course, it's Higgs. So I think that turnaround from audience to being on the stage is completely wonderful. And it's part of something that was going on. He became involved with a troupe called Interaction Theatre, which was run by an astonishing American guy called Ed Berman. And while he was having big plays put on at the big theatres, Jumpers and then Travesties, he was also doing a lot of very quirky work for Interaction and also for the radio. I mean, there's some wonderful early radio plays like Artist Descending a Staircase, in which the whole time zone goes backwards and then forwards again. And the central character is a blind woman, which is a brilliant concept for a radio play.
And this constant probing of language and probing of reality, and not accepting three-dimensional reality in the proscenium and arch as it is, that this restless questioning, this philosopher writing, was it necessary that he then went on to Jumpers? And was that his first establishment? It was National Theatre first up. Was that when he really arrived mainstream?
No, I think Rosencrantz was a mainstream success. I mean, everybody knew about him after Rosencrantz. I think there was there must have been something of a challenge in matching that and writing the next play that would be a huge hit. And then by the time of Travesties, he was up and away. And then I think you get a second wave of a different kind of fame and acclaim when you get to The Real Thing later on, and then when you get in the 80s, and then when you get to Arcadia. So, it's interesting, isn't it? There are authors who are always known as the author of Midnight's Children or Portnoy's Complaint, or and then that author has to do more and different work to not always be thought of as the author. So one of the remarkable things about Stoppard is that he was known as the author of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and then of Travesties, and then of Real Thing, and so on, and now of Leopoldstadt. So he's never stopped. He's never stopped. And I think one of the really wonderful things about the plays, however different they are, is that they're always trying to do several things at once. There's never only one idea. So he'll yoke together two wild extremes, like, Cold War spy story and quantum physics, chaos theory and 18th century landscape gardening. And you sort of think, no one else would have thought of doing that. That's really remarkable. The other thing I love is that he does what he calls ambushing his audiences, so that you will start to play like Travesties. If you go to the first scene of Travesties, where Joyce is dictating Finnegan's Wake and Tristan Zara is kind of doing some kind of mad surrealist, but you have no idea what's going on. The audience is just like this, and then you hope that you will find out a bit later what was happening.
Is there a risk that sometimes his sheer cleverness, his verbal pyrotechnics take over from the coherence as a dramatist, taking us towards a satisfying conclusion at the end?
Yes, it's the standard line on him that critics produce over and over again. The sort of
is it fair though? And does it matter if it is fair?
He knows it's coming. He always expects it. He say, "Oh, they'll say it's too clever by half." He wrote to his mother when Arcadia was about to come out. I don't know the answer to that, really. I've never thought that being brilliantly verbally dexterous was necessarily an antidote to deep feeling. That is often set up in him as there's a sort of, it's too clever to have any heart. And then when Real Thing and then Invention of Love and Arcadia came up, critics started saying, "Oh, he has a heart." But I've always thought that he had a heart right back in, Rosencrantz or Artist Descending a Staircase and plays like that. So I see the brilliant dazzle and wordplay and cleverness as sitting with something that deeply involves you every time. It is true that when you're watching it, if you haven't read it, you sometimes don't know what on earth is going on. And I think you just sort of go with the flow. I remember he told me a story once of having said to, I think it was Mike Nichols, this could be done very, very slowly, this bit. And Nichols said, yes, or very, very fast. Maybe doing it very fast is the way through,
Who has been the best or amongst the best interpreters of his work, directors and actors? I mean, some actors get it more than others.
Well, I think you have to go back to the early days and
Michael Borden and Jumpers. No.
Well, I actually was thinking of directors of Peter Wood,
Yeah.
and I was very, very sad that I started this job too late to talk to Peter Wood, who I think was one of the really dazzling interpreters. I mean, Peter Wood's travesties, and John Wood as Henry Carr in that production is completely unforgettable. And so I think that partnership of Tom Stoppard, John Wood and Peter Wood was for a while absolutely it. I think later on, I think David Laveau has been a wonderful interpreter of Stoppard's work, and I thought that more recently, Patrick Marber's rethinking of travesties and his work on Leopoldstadt, I think, have been incredibly impressive. There's also a terrific director who retired recently from ACT in San Francisco, a director called Carrie Perloff, who has faithfully done a great number of Stoppard's plays, and one tends to identify his work with male directors, but actually there have been a couple of really important women directors, Carrie Perloff and also Blanka Ziska in Pennsylvania, who've been very important.
We're going to move over to the questions. I have been feeding in some questions to Hermione while she's been talking, and let's come in with Emma, who's interested in you yourself and your own, what more you can say. I mean, you're a ferocious reader, Hermione, with an extraordinary appetite to get through books. Can you just name somebody there who particularly inspired you?
You mean the books amongst the books?
Yeah, that you yourself read.
Oh, people that I read.
Yeah.
Well, there's an awful lot of people to choose from, but I wrote a book about Edith Wharton. I wrote a biography of Edith Wharton, and one of the things that annoyed me was that Edith Wharton was always being set up against Henry James, as though somehow Henry James was more important. And I think that's sort of shifted now. But I had the fortunate position of being deeply in love with Henry James as well as with Edith Wharton. So there's something about Henry James which has been very inspiring to me, just in terms of his, and it's a bit like Virginia Woolf actually, that endless commitment to the task, that astonishing immersion in a life of writing. So, you know, although a very social creature, Henry James would occasionally pull back and he'd say, you can either go around the world accepting dinner party invitations, or you can sit at your desk and write. And things like that are very inspiring to me, in that I have often chosen to sit at my desk and write rather than go out and party sometimes. And I do like to go out and party, but I think I just admire so much. And in Virginia Woolf, in her diaries, if you read Virginia Woolf's diaries, you will see her telling herself to get on with it. You will see her saying to herself, take your fences, you know, don't be afraid, that kind of thing. And I'm very inspired by that. And speaking of don't be afraid, I'm also very, very inspired by Seamus Heaney and that life of work, which I just find altogether admirable. Well,
Stephen is asking, and you couldn't possibly say, but you did talk about Heaney there, which biography would you like to write next? Or whose biography, actually different question, whose biography would you like to write, but you haven't been given permission to do so?
I would have actually loved to write a book about Henry James, but it's all been done. So I have to set that one aside. I have got something in mind, which I don't really want to talk about yet, because superstitiously, I think it's a bit too soon. And also I'm still very much involved in thinking, but I must tell you that Tom Stoppard asked me this question when we'd sort of finished our work together. He said, have you got anything in mind next? And I said, I sort of have, but it's still just a kind of glint in my eye. He said, I have just one question for you, dead or alive? And I said, dead. And he said, well, that must be a relief.
But was it a relief? So stop press news story there. Hermione Lee has not told us who she's going to be writing about next, but they are dead. And was Tom Stoppard himself a bit relieved? Was he? Did you sense a slight jealousy there that you were now like a lover going on to somebody else and abandoning him?
No, I think he is very, very happy this job is done.
You're absolutely sure?
Yes.
I wonder. Joanne, good question. Joanne says, who do you think, Hermione, of as the readers of your biography? Do you have a set reader in mind?
That's such a good question. I thought about this very much when I was writing a book on Virginia Woolf, because there are many people who have their own version of Virginia Woolf. And who are deeply engrossed in her work. There are also many people who don't like the sound of her at all. And there are also many students who have who've got an idea of her as difficult and unapproachable. And she's not difficult, actually. She's challenging, but she's not difficult. She's often very funny. And she's very seductive in many ways. So when I was writing, I kind of constantly moved between these different kinds of readers. I moved between the kind of reader who didn't know anything about Virginia Woolf but might be interested, and the kind of reader who would already know everything in my story and would be sort of checking the story to see if I'd got right the bits they thought were important. And very often I hadn't, and they would tell me so in their reviews. So it's a very good question, and I don't quite know the answer to it. You are actually writing always, when you're writing biography, for a whole lot of different people. I think it's different if you're writing about someone who has not already got a huge reputation and a lot of books already written about them. So with Penelope Fitzgerald, there was no biography. The family asked me to write the first biography, and I hope there will be others. I'm sure there will eventually. So there you feel a responsibility to your readers that you are introducing a person. It's a big responsibility to be writing about them for the first time. With someone like, there is no one like Tom Stoppard, but in the case of Tom Stoppard, this is a person who is hugely well known and much followed and much written about, but he's not much biographized. And so there was a sense of needing to get the story as clear and as full and as rich as I could.
Which you've most certainly done. And another Joe, this is Joe Females, says, I think, Joe says, what happens if midway through, Hermione, you're writing, you suddenly discovered something that you didn't like and could have been awkward and embarrassing?
You mean every time, or just with this one?
Well, I think let's keep on Stoppard with it.
Yes, I didn't, but there were clearly things in his life, and you'd have to read the book to find out what they are, which must have been difficult for him to go back and think about again. And the disadvantage of writing about a living person is that other people who are involved in that person's life are also still living their lives. And why should they want to suddenly find themselves in a biography? So, you know, there's a limit sometimes to what other people will say to you about the past or about the bits of their life that have been where they have been close to him. So rather than finding some ghastly secret halfway through, which, you know, would have made me want to stop, nothing like that happened. But there were certainly moments where I felt that because this was a living person and because many of the characters in the book are living people, that I had to be scrupulous and careful, but not, I hope, censor myself.
Overly reverential.
No, I didn't want to be reverential.
It's Panima's asking, picking up there on what you were saying about being in love with Wharton and James, and the double edge of that, and how you feel when these 3, 4, 5, 6 years with Stoppard that you've spent in that company finishes, whether you feel a mini bereavement.
I felt it very much, that feeling when I finished working on Woolf in particular, partly because the end is so sad. I was living in my my husband was going out to work teaching at Leeds University, living in Yorkshire, and I was upstairs writing this book, and I remember coming downstairs once. He'd been living with this book for like 5 years, you know, and I came downstairs when he came back from work with tears rolling down my cheeks, and he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Well, she's died. I killed her today." And he said, "Yay!"
That's not very empathetic. But
it was a great moment in our lives. But you know, you do feel a sense of grief and a sense of loss, and it's partly to do with the voice. It's the fact that you've had a person's voice in your ear for a long time. In Woolf's case, the diaries, particularly in the letters. In Wharton's case, that wonderful sense of style and language. In Penelope Fitzgerald's case, the astonishing, mysterious world of the novels. And with Tom Stoppard, just this wonderful sense of excitement and enjoyment and laughter that one gets from so much of his work.
And with Woolf, and as we were saying earlier, last week I was talking to Juliet Nicholson, whose grandmother, Peter Sackville West, was, correct me here, saw Woolf a week before she died. The question, Hermione, is, did Woolf have to take her life? Could something have happened to have intervened?
Can we have a whole other hour now on that?
Unfair question.
I think it's a little bit late in the hour to start on that.
We have so many questions here, which I'm trying to bring in. How do you get people to talk? How do you get people to open up, and how do you get that balance where you've got the blend of oral evidence and which can often not be very accurate in terms of time and place?
I like that question very much. I have discovered that there is one thing you must never do when you are talking to people about your biographical subject and they're telling you things. Many times you will already know what they're telling you because you've been around and you've done your homework and so on. You must never say the words, "Yes, I know," because that's absolutely fatal, and then people will clam up. The other thing that I discovered, and I felt this very acutely, you know, you're going around to see some very eminent people in their field, many of whom no doubt ought to have or will have their own biographies written of them, and here you are asking them about someone else, and I think that's quite tricky. And I was very aware when I was going around that the generation that knew Woolf was still just there when I started my work. People like Francis Partridge and Stephen Spender and so on. All of them died, you know, within the 10 years of my doing that book. And you go around to these very extraordinary people, and you're going to say, "So tell me about the time you had tea with Virginia Woolf," as it were. So I always think it's rather offensive, actually, rude. So I would often take a very slow route in and talk to people and ask people about their own lives, and very often ask them to show me photographs if they had photographs, and then only really get round to talking about my subject kind of well into the conversation.
Being a good interviewer and biographer is not totally unlike being a therapist or counsellor or indeed psychiatrist.
No, I disagree. You're not curing anything. You're not there for good.
You're needing to be subtle. You're needing to be subtle. You're needing to play people in the nicest possible way. You're
not there for medical reasons. You're not there to do good. You're there to get something.
Oh, well, that's a provocative statement to think that psychiatrists are there to do good. I'm just going to say, what would Tom Stoppard say was his most complete play? Would he have an answer?
He has said two things about this, which he said not just to me, but I think quite often. One is that he feels that Arcadia is a play that just fell outright. like a game of patience falling out right. And I know exactly what he means. But the other thing he said to me, which I'm very touched by, is that The Invention of Love, which is the play about A. Houseman, where Houseman takes on the two roles played by two actors, the young Houseman and the old Houseman. In a way, he thinks that's his favourite play. He sometimes says that's his favourite play. He's not completely consistent about this, but just because he loved writing it so much.
And do you have a favourite play, Hermione?
Actually, this sounds pathetic, but you know, it sounds as though I'm just following in his footsteps. But I do love The Invention of Love. I think it's a really wonderful play. And then there are about 11 others that I would like to list, but there's no time.
And last question, totally frivolous. Tonight you're going to have dinner. We're going to arrange it for you with anyone, and this will not be the person you're next going to be writing about. Which writer would you really genuinely most like to have to dinner?
Chekhov.
And what would you ask? What would you ask him?
I wouldn't ask him anything. I'd just wait for him to tell me some stories. I'd just sit there basking.
Perfect answer. Hermione Lee, thank you so very, very much. We've really enjoyed it. And thank you for those great questions also.